Good afternoon. It's 2 o'clock, Monday, August 9th, and this is episode 1 of the Will Chamberlain Show. So to kind of give you some kind of background on this. I, for a solid 2 or 3 years there, was doing Periscopes very regularly, live streaming my commentary on Twitter to various places, with Periscope formally sort of essentially kind of folding back in I think a few months back. I've live streamed far less, and one of the things I've talked about with other members of the Human Events team has been we've been wanting to get a podcast network going. We see what the Daily Wire is doing and what other people are doing as well, and so we wanted to imitate that and go forward and create something similar with some of the people we have on board. As many of you know, we have Jack Kosovic on board. We have others on board as well. So this is the beginning of that. I've talked for a long time about doing podcasts, so we're going to turn this into a podcast. And so there are some good questions right off the bat that I'll quickly take before we get into the heart of the show. So will the shows be archived somewhere from Old Curmudgeon on Twitter? The answer to that question is yes. We're going to have to do this properly, like a true podcast. And it's going to go out on Apple Podcasts. It's going to be archived there. We're also going to put it up archived on the website. It's also currently, we're not just streaming to Twitter right now. We're streaming to YouTube, which is at youtube.com/human events, where you can subscribe if you want to watch it there. It's also on Facebook at facebook.com/human events media. So we're going to be in both places. We're going to be archived. But the basic idea here is to give you the idea, the sense of what I'm thinking in terms of the structure of the show. So we're going to do this every day, 2 o'clock Eastern. 2 o'clock Eastern works for me. It's a good time, so that's when we're going to do it. The basic format is I'm trying to merge something of the format of podcasts and live streaming. The thing about, so podcasts are generally kind of passive. It's usually just you speaking into the microphone, and then you create a recording that people can consume later. And live streams are obviously in the moment with interactive chat. I like both of those things. And I think, but part of it is that the format and they actually are really two different mediums in terms of what's best on a live stream isn't necessarily the best thing on a podcast, and vice versa. Especially because, if you're listening to a podcast from later on, then you might be kind of miffed about hearing comments, especially if someone's reading comments from a screen and isn't clear on what they're saying. So we will be going hard for basically the format I'm thinking of, and we'll tweak this as we go along, is kind of like 40 minutes of me just kind of going through the news of the day and the legal analysis I want to do. Because ultimately, that's what I want this to be focused on, is essentially, going through the news of the day, sort of Ben Shapiro style, and especially if there's something legal in the news, I'm going to want to talk about that. And then maybe 15 to 20 minutes that's more focused on question and answers, so that you get the dynamic of being able to interact. And there will still be a little bit of interaction, like I'll occasionally take a gander over at chat and see if I see a comment that's particularly on point. I might bring it in and talk about it in the course of the 40 minutes. But in general, that's kind of the dynamic I'm thinking about, so that when you are listening to this podcast, and if you're listening to it, when you're exercising or for whenever you manage to listen to your podcast in a passive way, you don't feel like it's weird and jarring. You feel like you're actually listening to something with the flow. And so that's the concept. I hope you'll join me on this. We're just going to keep doing this every day, Monday through Friday. With some, I'm getting married in a few weeks, so it's going to be a little tricky right around the wedding and the honeymoon. But we're going to try and keep this as productive as possible, so that you guys get good content. And so somebody asked, will it be on iTunes? Yes, it'll be on Apple Podcasts. That will be something that we do. I'm already kind of working with somebody who produces podcasts, a guy named Jeremy who produces for Ron Coleman. If you've seen that Ron Coleman had his podcast, I actually appeared on a few weeks back. We're gonna use his company and see if we can't get essentially clips and things like that. So a variety of things to give you some content. So what's going on today? So let's start it off. I think the big news of the day that I don't see too many people talking about is this Afghanistan thing, where you have basically what you have is a situation where we're already losing, right? Like we're already losing. We're pulling out of Afghanistan, and the Taliban is taking something like 5 or 6 cities, quoting from this New York Times article by Sharif Hassan. Quote, they have seized 6 cities in recent days, 5 of which are in northern parts of the country, and experts fear that if the government forces are unable to stop their advances in the north, Afghanistan's capital is more vulnerable than ever. Also a quote from Ramesh Salimi, a political analyst in Kabul, says, quote, the North is strategic for the Taliban because they believe that if they can capture these non-Pashtun areas, they can easily take control of the South and the capital, Kabul. Now, naturally, the fact that we are losing the war in Afghanistan probably isn't that surprising to most people. It's probably not shocking. And it's probably something that had to be expected given the fact that we were pulling out. Now, as a person who advocated for the pullout, I think it's kind of natural to expect ultimately the Taliban to take over. The reason we weren't able to prevail in 20 years of war is because we weren't able to assemble the means and the will to defeat the Taliban, which is a really, really challenging thing to do. And yet we have people like Liz Cheney tweeting out things like this. So she says, quote, what's happening in Afghanistan is catastrophic. U.S. forces on the ground were working with Afghan forces to prevent terrorists from establishing safe havens from which they can attack us again. Withdrawing U.S. forces is allowing terrorists and their allies to take over the country. So I want to stop. Like, we can take apart the specific logic, but we can also talk about the broader picture here. The broader picture is this is a war that went on for 20 years and we did not prevail. Now, if you are upset at the person who is withdrawing, and that would be Biden for saying we've lost this war, we need to leave, and you're blaming him for the consequences of your own war and the failure to succeed, you're doing it wrong. It's not on Joe Biden that the Afghanistan war failed insofar as what he's doing in 2020. To the extent that it's on Joe Biden, it would be on him for any involvement he had while a war was being conducted in the Obama administration. The point being that if you've got a 20-year war, like, it's on the people who started the war. It's on Liz Cheney. It's on Dick Cheney. It's not on the people who ended the war. So if there are bad consequences happening now because of withdrawal, but you had no meaningful plan to succeed, then it's on you. It's on Bill Kristol. It's on everybody who advocated for it. Good content from Ricky Frankel. He said, quote, I was not only invaded, I'm 29 now. That's the way I think a lot of people feel about the Afghanistan war, and for good reason. I remember I was a child. I was in high school when it started, and it's still ongoing. You know, at the end of a 20-year war, if you haven't accomplished anything, such that if your troops, if you pull out a few thousand troops, the entire country falls to the opponent you've been fighting the whole time, then you lost the war. The war was already lost from the get-go. And I mean, there are a lot of reasons you could talk about for why that's happened. Gary Kasparov has another very nitwit tweet, quote, a tragedy and a shame, many will be slaughtered and millions will be cast back into the Taliban dark ages. And it shows that America is an untrustworthy ally in contrast with dictators like Putin who show loyalty to their vile peers and allies. I mean, that's a fundamental problem with, I think, our modern foreign policy generally. I don't see Kasparov. I don't know if Kasparov was really, particularly incensed about the fact that we did a complete backflip on our policy towards the UAE and Saudi Arabia. I mean, the thing about American foreign policy is because we're a democracy with two different parties, and there really isn't as much of a bipartisan foreign policy anymore, like some amount of, essentially flexibility and flakiness is just going to be inevitable on the part of American foreign policy. We aren't a dictatorship, so we can't confidently say we will be in power for 20 years and keep foreign policy the same, which is something you need to take account of in advance when you actually launch these wars, which is, again, why this is ultimately, the neoconservatives' fault. And this in particular, this is a great tweet from Kasparov, like, not from a really great perspective. A quote, I supported Biden over Trump without reservations in 2020. He had the chance to set America back on the path of standing for good, for the values of its founding. Instead, he is charting a course for the most defeatist and defeated U.S. foreign policy in memory. Like, buyer's remorse much? Seems kind of obvious that would have been a problem. The idea that Biden was just going to be, he's 82 and you think he's this magic power to like set back America on the path of standing for good. The naivete here is pretty remarkable, especially for someone who's a world grandmaster. To me, the best take I saw on this, I like Jesse Kelly's take. Ancient Rome did a lot of things better than us, which is why their civilization lasted so much longer than ours will. One of those things is that their political leaders lead men in combat, not in the rear either. Consuls and senators regularly died in combat. It's a much better system. I agree with that. I think part of the underlying problem here is that there's a lack of skin in the game on the part of the leaders. And we don't necessarily have to go back to the political leaders being generals in the field to achieve skin in the game, but what we do need to do is to have something like people being expected to retire from public life if and when they do not basically like if and when they find themselves advocating for a war they don't agree with. Like something I think should happen, for example, is that Bill Kristol, every time he is in public, he should be confronted and told that he needs to retire from public life. Why? Because he's responsible for the Iraq War, which has wasted trillions in treasure, cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Like he is among those personally responsible for that massive foreign policy failure. In Japan, when you were dishonored as a leader, you were expected to commit seppuku. We don't need to go that far, but certainly I think there should be a sense of national honor, and especially expecting honor from our pundits, our politicians, et cetera, that if they they launch a failed war that has dramatically terrible consequences, they should have the honor to resign and then not participate in public life going forward. That's the basic thing that should happen. I'm just going to randomly quick one quote. Tom Salmon says, "This is great. Thank you. I appreciate that. If you like this, share it if you're on Facebook." So I do appreciate positive feedback. It's always good to see it. Okay, so that's the Afghanistan part. It's not on Joe Biden or anybody advocating withdrawal from Afghanistan if there are problems, if the Taliban is taking over. It's on the people who conducted a 20-year war that failed, right? Like you don't blame whoever decided to pull out, whatever member of the Soviet Union who decided to pull out of the Soviet Union, pull the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan, rather, for them losing the war. You blame the decision to go in the first place. The entire point is that Afghanistan has been known as the graveyard of empires for generations. So that's that. Next big issue, and this is where you get to Brianna Keilar. Quote, CBS News, the U.S. increases border deportations, prosecutions amid migrant surge. What's happening here? We have the Biden administration relaunching, starting to use its Title 42 authority again, which is a public health authority. DHS is saying that they've deported 242 migrant parents and children under the procedure. That's pretty trivial. That really isn't many. I guess it's just started, but that really isn't many. And they're saying things like, we want to discourage irregular migration. This is Manuel Padilla, who's an official with the Customs and Border Patrol. But here's the real number that I think, is kind of what's happening, and it should be triggering this. The U.S. agents along the border of Mexico likely made 210,000 migrant apprehensions in July, a monthly total not seen since 2000. Man, that's 20 years ago, 21 years ago. People who were born in 2000 can drink. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. So let's, okay, Biden's taking the border a little more seriously, apparently. Not much, because 242 is nothing. But we have, I think the bigger news of today is watching Brianna Keilar just make an absolute fool of herself. So this is, and I'm not sure you can hear this. I hope you can. But this is what she said basically she put out a 9-minute clip, and I'm going to see if I can't switch to headphones for this. Never mind, we'll just play it.
There are some in the Republican Party who insist that COVID isn't so bad. Certainly not bad enough
to wear
masks in school, even if they're too young to be vaccinated. But actually, it is bad. They say very bad. A threat, in fact, if it's undocumented immigrants bringing it into the country. And again, no evidence that they're responsible for the COVID surge in U.S. communities. It is the centuries-old trope of demonizing foreign people as disease. The R naught on that virus is sky high. And these conservative voices know that. They're the vectors here, infecting Americans they profess to care about with misinformation. And the rising case numbers, the lagging vaccination numbers are proof of that.
So I want to stop right there, because this is one of those things that, actually people kind of let this go, and they really shouldn't have. Like the thing Brianna Keilar is saying here is actually really quite offensive. She's saying that Republican politicians are vectors of misinformation infecting the public. Language like that, talking about people as an infection. Remember, like 30 seconds ago, Brianna Keilar talked about how it was terrible that people were bringing up this racist trope about immigrants infecting people, right, with COVID. And yet she then uses that exact same language to describe Republican politicians. And it reminds me of a broader double standard we have where Democrats feel no compunction about using dehumanizing language to describe conservatives. And it's a real problem. It's something that really should generally be objected to. And we'll get kind of into why. But first off, something she's just wrong. She's saying it's misinformation. We have a story here, something like 18% of families leaving Border Patrol custody tested positive for COVID. Like, no kidding, these places are COVID super spreader areas. You're bringing a whole bunch of people who are unvaccinated, who've been traveling in groups with a bunch of other unvaccinated people, and then you're putting them all together in, you know, these basically like shelters that are not separated. They're not socially distanced in the slightest. So it shouldn't be even a surprise. It's not, and it's not like a trope to talk about the fact that when you have people coming here illegally and then they're not screened for COVID, put together in these places, that it's a dramatically unsafe thing. And that indeed, blaming Biden for this is perfectly reasonable. It's not any particular slander on immigrants that this is a consequence of their action plus how the government is handling this thing. So that's part one of it. And, you know, I mean, the fact is, like, this is happening. It's something else to remember about all this. This is happening while the Biden administration has a very aggressive travel ban on Europe. And there's a great article from Ellen Carmichael, who describes her own, you know, she's on Twitter right here at Ellen Carmichael, and you can follow her. She's very good. But she describes like her own experience being married to her husband who lives in Austria, having a child with him, and then his inability to come back into the country. And that's, you know, he would be a legal visitor. He's, you know, there's nothing like that. There's nothing illegal about what he'd be doing, but for how aggressive the travel ban remains against Europe. And yet, while you have these aggressive travel bans against our allies, against other, you know, Canada, Europe, etc., the border is basically open. I mean, basically, we're rewarding illegal immigrants at the expense of people who like actually have a genuine reason to be here. So D Field says, miss these informative sessions with you. Again, I appreciate you guys coming to watch, and we're going to do more of them. You know, it's been a while, so we're going to do more of them. But the second point I want to make is that there's this again, the habit of dehumanizing language. Like, this is not the only Brianna Keilar tweet here. I think I might have, where'd it go? Hold on. Did it freeze? Hold on. Okay, here we go. Here we go. So we have this one. This tweet blew my mind. Quote, unvaccinated Americans, disproportionately Republican Fox viewers, are fueling the surge, not migrants who are near 100% tested and quarantined if positive. Why not talk about the border crisis without dabbling in BS and racist tropes about immigrants? You know, it's just the performative contradiction in all this is astounding. Where does it say that Republican Fox, what's your evidence for saying it's Republican Fox viewers who are fueling the surge of COVID who are primarily unvaccinated? That's not the data I've seen. This is the latest data. This is August 4th, the latest data on COVID-19 vaccinations by race, ethnicity. Oh, sorry, this is the wrong graph. This is the one I wanted to show you. Here we go. Let's see, I guess we can see it here. The percent of the total population that's received one dose as of August 2nd, 2021, 49% of the white population, 38% of the black population, 43% of the Hispanic population. Do you have some evidence that it's the Republicans that are holding us back, that are disproportionately holding us back? No. And Glenn Riedel also tweeted about this, how if you actually, this is a graph of, you know, where the vaccinations are and the vaccination rates, obviously in like upper, you know, Manhattan, where you have like near 100% rates, that's not the issue. But, you know, one of the primary places he talks about is being, you have like Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods and black neighborhoods where people are not vaccinated. So it's not nearly as simple as just saying, oh, it's just Fox viewers who aren't getting vaccinated. And moreover, it's a weird sort of soft bigotry of low expectations. It's like that's the only group of people that it's acceptable to blame. Maybe in general, I don't think it's acceptable to blame anybody for being unvaccinated at the moment. It's an experimental vaccine. I would encourage people to get it. I think people should, but I hate the blame game with this. Like, it's not fully FDA approved yet. Persuade people to take it if it's in their own interest. You know, the way I look at the vaccine is pretty simple. I've personally had COVID. I tested positive. I had it back in November. I've read the studies that suggest pretty strongly that if you have had it previously, you have pretty robust immunity. I think there's a Cleveland Clinic study that came out 2 months ago that said something to that effect. So, but if you haven't had it, I'd highly recommend getting it, because having COVID is pretty gnarly, and so you want to get some antibodies in your system if you don't have it. And that's what I'd recommend there. But again, it's just this weird like bullying talk from people like Brianna Keilar towards a very particular group of people. Like one way to conceptualize what's going on is this sort of war between like the war of white liberals versus white conservatives. And it's clear like they aren't actually that obsessed with the struggle of people of color in their political coalition. It's literally just they see them as a tool to beat the other side with. They just loathe conservative Americans. And then so they're just, but like won't talk about their allies in the coalition. And there's another thing, like, again, the dehumanizing language, like finding, this is totally a bigoted tweet blaming Republicans for things generally. It's like a follow-on of how, talking about Republicans as vectors of misinformation, spreading the disease of misinformation. It reminds me of like when the fact that liberals like feel no problem calling people maggots. Like this is one of those basic things I think in general, and it's important to talk about this because I don't think anybody should be using dehumanizing language. Like referring to other people as insects is bad. There's a lot of decent literature on the fact that this is what happened in Rwanda. Like the Hutus refer to the Tutsis as insects. Like don't refer to your opponents as insects. It's a bad thing to do. It's wrong. It's immoral. It opens the door to treat them like insects, which is not how any human being should be treated. And I say, it's funny, today I was randomly, Josh Hawley's tweet was on Twitter and he was trending. I was trying to figure out why. Found this tweet as one of the first one that popped up from a guy named Don Lewis. Quote, "Can we buy Rand Paul's neighbor a house next to Josh Hawley?" Like classic example of this sort of what happens when you start dehumanizing your opponents. Democrats genuinely are cheering on political violence against politicians and thinking we just need more of it. If you guys don't remember, Rand Paul was attacked by his neighbor, tackled randomly. He suffered a collapsed lung, was very seriously ill for a very long time. And we basically, Democrats give themselves an exception to use dehumanizing language while criticizing Republicans for racist tropes. It's beyond, it's totally unacceptable. In a normal world, Keilar would be fired for this garbage. She still probably should be. And, I remember when people got on James Lindsay's case for saying something about how wokeness contains the seed of a genocide. And this is exactly the kind of thing we're talking about. If your ideology creates for you a blind spot whereby you can treat a certain group of people as less than, right? A certain group of people, like it just on the basis of their race, on the basis of basically what's the word? Ingrained factors. I forget exactly what the word is. I try and speak for a living and I forget words. But those essentially those ingrained factors, things that you're outside of your control, and you blame people for them and want to impose on them in this way. That's literally, and then you talk about them as insects. That's actually what you talk about as the seed of the genocide. Ricky says Twitter love doesn't play in the background. It's true. We're not quite there yet. I'm using StreamYard, which is the way that I'm able to multi-stream this both to Twitter and to YouTube and to Facebook. So that's what I think about there. I think Keilar's getting wrecked for her just unwarranted assumption that it's Republicans who are spreading the disease when she has no evidence to back that up. But more importantly, I think the way that she and other liberals talk about Republicans needs to be called out way, way more. Like we shouldn't be afraid to say, like this is dehumanizing language. You don't call people insects. If you're not calling out people who say these things and treating them as saying something beyond the pale, then you're doing it wrong. Next topic. So that's the end of the COVID and Brianna Keilar stuff. I wanted to talk about a very good piece we had on humanevents.com from Shipwreck Crew. Let's see if we can zoom this back down a little bit. It's a little big. So this is something that came up. We had an article published August 5th from Shipwreck Crew, a former federal prosecutor. And I know there's a lot of people on our side who, I got a lot of weird flack for hiring him because he can have sharp elbows on Twitter. But we didn't hire him so much, but we've solicited his contributions. And the reason I solicited his contributions is exactly for pieces like this one. What this piece lays out is actually a very interesting turn of events in the January 6th prosecutions over the Capitol breach. So, here's the key thing. Offering pleas to misdemeanors and dismissing felonies violates written DOJ policies. So what's happening in some of these cases, especially with the ones that were indicted very early, all the way back in February and March, is that people were prosecuted with this 20-year felony for entering the Capitol. And there was a plea and a sentence reached pretty recently. A sentence was 8 months in jail. And you think, oh, that's a really severe sentence for this. And it is. It's way more severe than liberals would get under certain circumstances. Like think about the Kavanaugh protesters who totally got themselves involved with about the Kavanaugh protesters who totally got themselves interrupted all those hearings when Kavanaugh was trying to be confirmed. And those people got catch and release, pay a $50 fine and you're gone. And the Capitol breach protesters are facing 6 months in jail. It's a dramatic difference in how these people are being treated. But there's another, kind of aspect to it is that, the judges are saying a lot of horrible things about the protesters, but then you look at the sentence for the guidelines range, and to understand, I mean, we can go to a whole spiel about the federal sentencing guidelines. But basically they provide a way to kind of, using certain factors, you calculate what the sentence should be in general, like a range. In this case would be like something like 15 to 21 months. The idea behind guidelines is that they're there to make sure that, there aren't disproportionate sentences all over the country. Guidelines, but they're not binding on judges, so judges can depart upwards or downwards. In this case, the judge actually departed well downwards from the guidelines range for this crime, right? It was a felony crime, the 20-year max sentence. Guidelines range was 15 to 21 months for one of these Capitol breach protesters, and he got like 8. And what happens then is that actually creates a huge problem for DOJ and for the judges. Why? Because if that's now the baseline standard for a lot of these felony charges, and these people have been held without bond for 8 months, we're running into like the problem where the sentence that they would receive for the crime they are charged with will be less than the amount of time they've spent in jail. And what that's creating is a burden on these judges who are like, hurry things up, because there's this delay. Like, these trials are getting pushed back, because there's so much material that the prosecutors have to work through and like try and deliver in their discovery obligations for so many different defendants, and they're not able to do it. And so what's happening is they're doing things they never do. They're offering pleas to misdemeanors and dismissing felony charges, right? Like, and Shipwreck Crew does a great job explaining in this article, which I highly recommend you read the whole thing. It's really, really good. And does a really good job explaining how DOJ is basically in full retreat right now on a lot of these cases. They're basically allowing people to plead to an offense and then get a sentence that is time served, right? If they're already still in jail, and get out, which is they don't normally have to do that, but they're doing it because judges are setting trial dates and they don't want to get humiliated, and so they have to just let people go. Which is, again, a real like problem of how these cases were indicted. Like, one of the things that Shipwreck Crew does a really good job of highlighting is that what happened here is people were arrested first and then held without bail and then investigated later. And that's not normally how DOJ does things. And that's how they avoid this problem in the first place, where they can't meet their discovery obligations. Think about how long it took to indict somebody like Avenatti or Epstein, or, federal justice moves pretty slowly because generally the prosecutor's offices want to get all their ducks in a row before they file the indictment and make the arrest and say somebody should be held without bail, because then they don't have to worry about like, oh, well, what happens if we need to go to trial in 3 months? Well, we're ready for it, so who cares? So this is actually a real interesting problem, and I think it goes to a very interesting, like, fundamental injustice. It's like the problem with like treating these protesters as though they're like these hardened criminals who need, like, Joe Biggs is rotting in jail right now. It's a terrible injustice, and DOJ can't even get its ducks in order to prosecute these people, and because really they're breach cases. They have to, and there's a lot of evidentiary issues. So I think that's something I'd highly recommend you read. Also recommend you read Shipwreck Crew's blog. This is at Substack. So shipwreckcrew.substack.com is very good. Highly recommend this stuff. Like, the thing is, he can be very sharp in criticisms of the people I like Julie Kelly and Darren Beatty. And I like those people. Don't get me wrong. Like, I'm fans of both. But like, I value his experience and his knowledge about this area of law. Like, he was a federal prosecutor for 22 years. Federal criminal law is very complicated. I'm not an expert in federal criminal law at all, and that's despite being a practicing lawyer. So I highly recommend reading him. So we got about 10 minutes left. Let's talk about a few other things here. This is another interesting tweet from today, Technofog, who I also like a lot. Quote, DOJ January 6 evidence that has not yet been produced to the criminal defendants. We possess some information that law enforcement authorized people to enter the restricted grounds. And I mean, I think he's being a little cute with this quote where he's like cutting this off, because it says, we possess some information that the defense may view as supportive of arguments that the law enforcement authorized defendants. Still kind of important, but it goes to show the problem. Like, these attorneys have a Brady obligation to produce all exculpatory evidence. And it's pretty challenging to do that when you're talking about thousands of hours of videotape. Very, very challenging to do that. What else is, so now we're kind of got a potpourri, because I got about 10 minutes left, so we'll just keep talking about various other things that happened today. Someone else mentioned this one. We had I forget. There was a comment about this in particular, but Obama had a birthday bash this weekend, and there was a New York Times reporter who said this is a low risk thing because of the sophisticated vaccinated crowd. The funny thing is, there's an element of truth. Like, when groups of vaccinated people meet, there is low risk, but you wouldn't find that from the New York Times reporting, and you certainly wouldn't suggest that from the fact that they're imposing mask mandates. They want to impose mask mandates everywhere. And what you're really seeing is this sort of like, it's the same like aristocrat peasant divide that we're constantly seeing throughout our politics. It's manifested in COVID particularly sharply. Think about Gavin Newsom imposing a brutal mask mandate and then going to the French Laundry. We're going to keep seeing this happen over and over again because in reality, they are virtue signaling about the disease, but they're not willing to adhere to their own standards. Something else on the sort of big, when we talk about aristocrat peasant, I actually wrote an article about 2 years ago, Carlos Maza's Reign of Terror. Highly recommend you go read it. But one of the points I make is that, Carlos Maza at that time was like complaining about being attacked by Steven Crowder and wanting to get him deplatformed while simultaneously apologizing for what was called milkshaking people, like throwing milkshakes at protesters. Dude was just willing to say, violence by my side is perfectly fine, but God forbid this person say something mean about me on YouTube. Totally ridiculous. And again, for folks, just you're wondering, I'll get to questions in about a little less than 10 minutes. So if you want to stick around for that. Oh, right. Today's the commemoration of Nagasaki. So commemoration, not something you really want to commemorate, but it's the 76th anniversary of the second atomic bomb, which was used in August 1945. And of course, we're getting a lot of tweets. This was from the Hiroshima thing. Quote, more than 140,000 people killed, nearly all of them civilians, not a single person held accountable. Hiroshima, never again. I mean, there's a real lack of understanding of like the reality of war. And especially when it comes to the decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. Yes, a lot of civilians died, but we were at war and we were going to invade the home islands. People don't realize the death toll we were expected to suffer. Like 75 years later, there are Purple Hearts that, this was published last year, August 2020. The Purple Hearts that were made in anticipation of us invading Japan, they're still being used. They're still being awarded to injured soldiers. The reason for that is we were expected to lose something like 1 million service men and women. I think it was probably mostly servicemen, but 1 million servicemen in the course of invading the Japanese Hawaiian Islands. Their entire strategy at that point, like they couldn't meaningfully conduct a war. Their strategy was predicated on making us suffer so many losses that we'd be forced to make terms, that we would forced to like make peace with the military regime. Not, they might have to give up all their territories, but at least they wouldn't have to do unconditional surrender and submit to war crimes trials. And that's what we were facing. And so when people are like, oh, how dare the United States use the atomic bomb to end the war? Like, do you realize how many people, like something as simple as the battle for Iwo Jima, something like 40,000 Americans died in the course of taking that one small island? 40,000. That's just it was a tiny island in the Pacific. Couldn't have a broad front that killed even more. People just underrate, the sheer scale of death in World War II was astounding. Bringing it to an end was just, even if it meant killing more. And in reality, like the idea that the atomic bomb is the unique problem here. I mean, the firebombing of Tokyo killed far more than 140,000. Like war provides like really bizarre consequences. And it's a really good reason not to start war. It's one of the reasons I have so little time for people who talk about give back the land and, what's going on, take the side of the Palestinians who essentially want to fight another war. I don't like any of that. Who is this? This person gets blocked. Okay. So that's something I feel pretty strongly about. And if you want to learn more, a great book on the subject, I've actually read this one, Downfall, the End of the Imperial Japanese Empire, by Richard Frank. Highly recommend it. I think you'll get a huge kick out of it if you're a history buff. And it really goes into detail about exactly what was happening at the end of the war and the strategy of the Japanese. Other things that are kind of bizarre. I don't know if you guys saw this tweet right here, but you had like in France, apparently they're literally checking your passports when you're out and about. Like they'll check them and make sure that like you're not doing anything truly horrible. Like make sure that you've gotten your vaccine if you're out and about at a restaurant. I don't want to live in a world like that. I've been a pretty big COVID hawk for the most part. I'm not for this. Like, I'm not for checking people's papers if they're out in public. I'm just not for it. I would think police have better things to do with their time. There's serious insecurity in a lot of places in France, serious crime, and you're out there checking everybody to make sure they have the vaccine if they're at a restaurant. Like, doesn't feel like a free country to me. And we don't need to be there. People feel like you need to coerce people to take a vaccine. You don't. Just persuade them. Just persuade them. I think there's a fundamental problem with kind of the approach generally to the vaccine discussion overall. Like, people are like, how are we going to coerce people? How are we going to like give them a stick and make sure they know that they should get the vaccine? It's like, no, just persuade them. Just persuade them. The logic is on the side of the people who say, if you haven't been infected and you don't have any immunity to it, then you should probably go get the vaccine so you have some immunity to it. The logic there is really strong, right? Like, we know we can be very confident that the vaccine prevents severe illness. So reduces your chances of contracting it, reduces the chances of severe illness, reduces the chance of death, all substantially. And there are possible potential side effects, but nothing that's come up so far would outweigh that dramatic benefit. And so I think just like, why you don't have to keep coercing people to do this. It's so asinine. And the more you coerce people, the more you just kind of spur, like, there's a reason people don't trust public health authorities. There was a great thread, I forget exactly, Konstantin Kisin, I think, did it, where he's like, look at all the ways in which our major authorities have been untrustworthy over the past months. And like, why would people trust them again? And I think, once you like, just stop trying to force people to do this. I really think it's important. Really, really think it's important. There was this fact that I love that Twitchy I tweeted this just offhand, and literally somebody wrote it up and put it up there. This is really funny. Will Chamberlain's response after Mitt Romney calls the infrastructure bill is a win for all of us. I don't even think this is my best tweet, but I'll thank you, Twitchy. That's nice. If you weren't skeptical of the infrastructure bill before, you should be now. The fact that Mitt Romney likes anything is a reason to be skeptical of whether it's good or not. There's no more useless politician in the Republican Party than Mitt Romney. I haven't even read the details of the bill, but I'm skeptical. Mitt Romney should be on the wrong side of especially any of these bipartisan issues. And finally, something I might get into tomorrow, but that there's a real issue, is that a lot of the people who worked, there's a lot of like high prominent liberals who Andrew Cuomo was able to call on to try and get help when he was under threat, back a few months ago. And so he was getting PR help from a lot of people who probably shouldn't have helped him. One of them is Roberta Kaplan, who is like on the board of Time's Up, which is the big anti-sexual harassment, pro Me Too organization. There's a lot of other issues like this. I think the head of a human rights campaign is facing something similar. But there's this it's really interesting how that movement was definitely co-opted by elite Democrats who then weaponized it to only apply to Republicans or people they wanted, and certainly used it almost as insulation for elite Democratic politicians who did the same thing. All right, that's all I have. It's 2:38, which means I hit about my 40 minutes of straight content. Now I'm going to go through comments for a while, and kind of go through and start from the beginning even. So this show will be on iTunes. Remember, this is the beginning of a podcast, and so this will appear on iTunes. So as Unaffiliated Mom says, ask that question. This show will indeed be on iTunes. Somebody on the Afghanistan, Matt Hammond asks, why is the US government not pushing to change their economy from opium to rare earth metal mining? They've been trying to push them off of opium for a very long time. It's very challenging to do that because of the reliability of opium profits and the ease of growing that particular crop. And also there's a fundamental problem, which is, and we can talk about this more, but we were basically supporting, it's hard to say this, we were basically supporting the child rapists in Pakistan. I don't know if you're familiar, I forget exactly what the name of the practice here, but it is there. But there's a practice of sexually abusing teenage boys. And the Taliban were the ones opposed to that practice, and we were supporting the warlords indulging in that against the Taliban. How hard would you fight to keep the child rapists from running your country? I think that's a fundamental problem with our entire Afghanistan strategy and why it was no premise. Silent Jessica Wijdo says, I had no this idea it was going to happen, and I'm glad it did. I'm glad I'm here. I'm glad you guys are here. Thank you for watching. Still got like 90 solid going on, and we're just going to keep doing it. Like, you got to realize how long we were out of the habit. Sometimes, whatever, viewership is not what it was during the George Floyd stuff. Viewership's not what it was in the run up to the election, whatever. Like, I want to get back into the groove of doing this on a daily basis and giving my analysis and creating content for you guys. That's what I'm going to do. Chris Moreno says, quote, anyone who knew history should have been wise enough to not enter the wasteland called Afghanistan. That's a pretty, agreed with that. Also, Matt Hammond, the Taliban is comparable to drug cartels. True. All right. Peggy Cryer says, Afghanistan has one of the largest mineral deposits in the world. Why have we been in Afghanistan again? That's the real question. Like, we were there because we thought they were hiding Osama bin Laden, who would probably cross the border over to Pakistan pretty quickly. Now we were trying to like build a new regime and protect women's rights in a country that just is one of the hardest countries to govern in the world. No, just doesn't make sense. D Field says she misses these informative sessions with me. Thank you. I miss you all too. I need to be doing this more. I'm happy to be doing it. Let's see. As somebody, Tom says, I watch Fox and I'm vaxxed and I'm a Republican conservative. I really don't like, as I said before, I really don't like the bigotry, just assuming Republicans aren't vaccinated. I think a huge chunk of Republicans are vaccinated. A huge chunk of Fox watching Republicans are vaccinated. There's been a pretty consistent message, especially among people in vulnerable groups and from Republican governors who did a really good job getting their elderly vaccinated, people like Ron DeSantis. And yet there's just this automatic bigoted assumption that because the Republicans are questioning people like Fauci, that means they're implicitly always questioning the vaccine. That's a much smaller faction that's doing that. And Tom also says that he's qualified to consider the government's handling of the border to be a disaster. I think that's pretty good. So, yeah, Brett the Illustrator says something interesting. He says, quote, I had a discussion with a guy calling me a maggot. I was like, we can discuss, but don't call me that. I feel the same way. Like whenever I see somebody use that language, it just blows my mind that they think it's acceptable. It's never acceptable in polite company to refer to somebody, you know, as an insect. Let's see. Dave Bear says, I really hope these people sue the DOJ prosecutors, wardens, prison guards. And Dave is saying that in reference to the January 6th defendants. I think it'll be a very uphill challenge for them to prevail. Like, you know, we have some reporting that they're being kept apart, but it's just generally, I know how hard it is to win those cases. They're very, very difficult. Gavin McInnes has been covering Joe Biggs. Yeah, no, I feel like Joe Biggs, I know Joe Biggs, and he's a nice guy, and I've had good interactions with him, and it's sad to see him. I mean, I know I'm sure he's struggling in jail right now. I think it's really sad how wildly aggressive they've been, especially in relationship to other people. Like, I absolutely would be fine. To be fair, I am like the right to jail person. I do believe generally, I don't like rioting, and I would like to see it broadly punished more toughly. But the idea that this would only happen when there's a right-wing protest, no, not okay. Dark Queen Duck asks, are there legal means for pushing back on vaccine mandates? It's tricky. I think Harmeet Dillon actually had a good tweet on this. Let me go look her up. Dillon vaccine mandates Twitter. Let's see if I can find it on Google. She had something very interesting to say on this. That's not it, but she had a tweet. I highly recommend you guys follow Harmeet Dillon if you don't already. PM John, and she had a tweet thread that she's like, look, your odds of actually prevailing in litigation against these vaccine mandates are pretty minimal. Like, you may be able to get an exemption for like a medical or religious purpose, but the idea that you could broadly be exempted or fight against the vaccine mandates is low. And that makes sense based on my understanding of the law. Like, one of the big Supreme Court authorities on things like vaccine mandates and emergency powers of the government is a case called Jacobson from the early 1900s, where the Supreme Court said that a state law requiring vaccination was constitutional. You'd be surprised how aggressive early case law is about public health measures. I mean, we forget because we haven't really had a pandemic this serious in 100 years. So nobody living really remembers what it's like. But, you know, the founders had to deal with things like yellow fever all the time. And so there were all sorts of aggressive quarantine measures put in place and that were treated as very normal, even under the sort of guise of, you know, the revolutionary fight for liberty. So I don't think it's going to be nearly that easy to push back on vaccine mandates. And again, I don't like vaccine mandates. I think I'm pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine mandate, if that makes sense. I think people should get the vaccine, especially if they haven't been infected. But I am not going to be the kind of person who says I think they should be mandated. CS, this is a great comment. My grandfather was a green 19-year-old Marine in 1945. I'm damn happy we dropped the bomb because I like the fact that I exist. I think that's exactly right. You know, we had the right to end the war. It was a total war. Japan started the war by attacking our military installations without warning, without declaration, and they weren't surrendering. And we had the right to continue the war. You know, that's the rules of war are different than the rules of everything else. We had the right to continue the war and end it. Let's see, quote, coercion makes it seem sketchy. I think this is Steph making the point I was making earlier about the fact that the attempt to impose vaccine mandates is actually increasing vaccine hesitancy. I think that in general, like, I hate seeing people trying to coerce people and instead just persuade them. Let's see. Somebody says, if the leaders had been open about how little anyone knows about the COVID virus from the very beginning, it would be easier to trust them. You know, unfortunately, their instructions have been all over the board. There is a big credibility problem. I wish they had resolved it. Things like masks is the biggest frustration, because I remember we were one of the first people out there who was advocating for the use of masks back in March 2020 at Human Events, well before the public health authorities were willing to. While the public health authorities were saying don't buy masks because, you know, the nurses need them. That never made any sense. There's just, I mean, something else we could talk about as a general theme is the way the public health authorities thought they were thinking politically rather than, you know, about being disinterested reporters. In the same way that like news reporters are trying to bias a side or push an agenda, it's like public health officials had their own agenda. Maybe that agenda might have been noble in the sense of ensuring we get through the pandemic, but it's like they were willing to shade the truth a little bit to do what they saw as serving that agenda, which is just a really bad way to go about doing things. Titan Kansas asks, what's an update on the Durham report? What happens to investigations from previous administrations? It's still ongoing. I don't see a reason why, you know, that special counsel office is still operating. I don't know that we'll get a report right away. It's too bad we didn't get it sooner, but I think I assume it's still happening. I wouldn't take the fact that it's been so delayed as an assumption that it's not going on. You know, these things normally take time, and the sort of ridiculous rush nature of the Mueller report is sort of abnormal, is my understanding. Why haven't the right-wing press been pushing the Newsom recall more? I don't know. Just it's easy to get distracted. We live in a very fast news cycle. Let's see. Yeah. Say what you want about the Taliban. At least they aren't child rapists. That's exactly right, CS. And then finally, Robert Barnes. David Bear says Robert Barnes has a pre-created form on his locals for it. I think this is in relation to the attempt to fight vaccine mandates. It's still going to be very, very challenging to win based on that. Like don't think that you as just a random person handing a document like that to your employer is going to change things. I think that would be very, you might scare the random small business employer, but like any normal business with an in-house legal department would look at that and be like, you didn't hire a lawyer. Like, I don't know. I just don't think it's going to be that effective. I guess we have one more question. We're all the way at the end of the comments. So two more. Why has the CDC been so cagey about stats surrounding new mask policies? There was a whole piece today about them being cagey generally about statistics. I would like them to stop. I really think that in order to rebuild trust, the public health authority should be like super duper transparent and releasing statistics in real time, and stop trying to like hide, stop trying to like worry about the consequences of releasing the stats. Just release them. Americans are adults. They can figure it out. And finally, whatever happened to federal charges with the shoving? I think those are still ongoing. But they're probably going a lot slower given the lack of urgency since he's sitting in jail. Okay. All right. Well, we've gone through the comments. That concludes the inaugural Will Chamberlain show. I know I've done a lot of Periscopes in the past, but this is the very first podcast. I want to thank you all for listening. If you listened to the whole thing, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got value out of it. If you have suggestions, comment either on YouTube or Twitter and reply or whatever. Like, comment about what you'd like to see, comment about what you think I could be doing better, comment about what you want to talk about, and comment just generally about the format. And share this, obviously. Like, we want to keep getting traction. I'm happy to spend this time with you, and I'm going to make a plan to spend an hour with, well, maybe 50 minutes. 50 minutes is a long time. I need like a full glass of water to talk for this long. But make a plan to spend 50 minutes with you every day, Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. That's the idea. So hope you guys all enjoyed it, and I will talk to you tomorrow afternoon. Later, folks.